I still remember the exact moment my world crumbled. Standing in that elegant living room, wearing my designer dress that suddenly felt cheap, watching everyone's faces turn toward me with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. My husband's lawyer cleared his throat and repeated the words that made my knees buckle. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson has been the sole owner of the Riverside estate since 1983. All 5 properties, including the one you've been living in. Mrs. Davis. The manila folder he slid across the mahogany table contained property deeds with dates, figures, and signatures that made my accusations evaporate into thin air. The woman I'd been ordering around, criticizing, and calling the help in whispered phone conversations for 2 years wasn't a stubborn old maid my husband had charitably employed. She was his mother, the multimillionaire matriarch of the family whose fortune I'd been spending. And the look in her eyes told me she had heard everything. I can still feel the silence that filled that room, how it pressed against my eardrums until I thought they might burst. My husband Richard's face had transformed into something I didn't recognize. Hard lines where there used to be an indulgent smile. "I think," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite everything I'd put her through, "that it's time we discussed the conditions of your continued residence in my home." That's when I realized I had built my entire marriage on a foundation of lies, and now, in front of 12 witnesses, including our family lawyer, my house of cards was tumbling down. How could I have been so blind? So arrogant? But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to know how it started. How I, Vanessa Davis, once the golden girl of Lakeside Heights, ended up mistaking one of the wealthiest women in the state for hired help, and built an entire lifestyle on a misunderstanding that would eventually cost me everything. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a series of choices, each one taking me further down a path I never should have walked. And I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened, when it happened, and what I lost along the way. Because maybe, just maybe, you'll recognize something in my story that will save you from making the same mistakes. Let me take you back 3 years and 47 days ago to the charity gala at the Westbrook Country Club where I first met Richard. I was 39, freshly divorced from my college sweetheart who'd left me for his 26-year-old assistant, and determined to rebuild my life on my terms. The alimony barely covered my condo payments, and my job as a pharmaceutical sales rep was steady, but not spectacular. I'd spent $430 on a red dress I couldn't afford, because I needed to look like I belonged in that room full of the city's elite. That's when Richard Davis approached me. Champagne flute in hand, 6'2" of silver-haired confidence in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "You look like the only person here who isn't pretending to enjoy themselves," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive timbre that comes from generations of private school education. I laughed, surprising myself. "Is it that obvious?" I replied, taking a sip of my champagne to hide my nervousness. He smiled. God, that smile could light up a room, and said, "Authenticity is rare in these circles. It's refreshing." We talked for hours that night, and I found myself drawn to his quiet confidence, the way he listened when I spoke as if my words actually mattered. By the end of the evening, he'd asked for my number, and I'd given it, feeling a flutter of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. What I didn't know then was that Richard Davis, with his kind eyes and gentle manner, would lead me into a world where nothing was as it seemed, and the price of admission would be my integrity. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Weekend trips to Napa Valley, dinners at restaurants where the menu had no prices, a surprise birthday weekend in a beachfront suite in the Hamptons. Richard was 15 years older than me at 54, divorced for a decade with grown children, and seemed eager to spoil me in ways my ex-husband never had. "You deserve beautiful things," he would tell me as he fastened a tennis bracelet around my wrist or handed me keys to a new Lexus. 6 months after we met, he proposed on a private yacht cruise around the harbor, down on one knee with a 3.5-carat diamond ring that caught the sunset and scattered light like tiny flames across the polished deck. I said yes through tears, believing I'd finally found my happily ever after with a man who valued me. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why a man who seemed to have everything wanted someone like me so quickly. The first time I met Eleanor was at our engagement dinner. Richard had mentioned his mother lived with him temporarily, following some health issues, but described her as independent and insistent on making herself useful. The elegant Tudor-style mansion took my breath away when we pulled up the circular driveway. "This is where you live?" I asked, trying not to sound as impressed as I felt. Richard merely nodded, squeezing my hand. "Home, sweet home. Nothing special, but it's comfortable." "Nothing special?" The place had at least 6 bedrooms from what I could tell, with manicured gardens and a fountain out front. When we entered, a woman in her 70s was arranging flowers in the foyer. She wore simple clothes, navy slacks, a light blue blouse, sensible shoes, and her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun. "Eleanor," Richard called out, "I'd like you to meet Vanessa." The woman turned, and I was struck by her piercing blue eyes, the same shade as Richard's. She nodded politely, but didn't smile. "It's nice to meet you," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. I extended my hand, but she had already turned back to the flowers. "Dinner will be ready at 7, she added, arranging a stem of lilies with careful precision. I glanced at Richard, confused by the cool reception, but he just shrugged slightly. "Mother likes to keep to herself," he whispered as he guided me toward the living room. I remember thinking it was odd that his mother was preparing dinner instead of hired help in such an obviously wealthy household, but I dismissed it as eccentricity. Rich people, I reasoned, could be quirky. Perhaps she enjoyed cooking. It never occurred to me then that this woman arranging flowers with work-worn hands owned everything I was admiring. That night, I would make the first of many terrible assumptions that would eventually lead to my downfall. The dinner was exquisite. Roasted duck with cherry reduction, wild rice pilaf, and haricots verts prepared to perfection. Eleanor served each course efficiently, joining us at the table only after everything was laid out. The conversation was strained, with Richard doing most of the talking while his mother watched me with those unsettling blue eyes. "Richard tells me you work in pharmaceutical sales," she said finally, her fork poised mid-air. I nodded, launching into a description of my job that suddenly sounded trivial in this opulent setting. "Interesting," was all she said before returning to her meal. Later, as she cleared the plates despite my offer to help, I whispered to Richard, "You should really hire someone to help. Your mother with the housework. She must be exhausted doing everything herself at her age." He gave me an odd look, but didn't respond. That night, as we drove back to my condo, I asked why his mother seemed to act as the household help. "Eleanor prefers to stay busy," he said carefully. "She's always been that way." I should have pressed further. I should have recognized the evasion for what it was. But I was already too enchanted by Richard and the life he was offering to look beyond the surface. Our wedding 3 months later was a lavish affair at the Bellamy Hotel downtown. 200 guests, a 6-tier cake, my designer gown that cost $12,800, and a honeymoon in Santorini that felt like a dream. Throughout the planning process, Eleanor remained in the background, quiet but observant. I interpreted her reserve as disapproval of me. A middle-class divorcee marrying into what I assumed was Richard's wealth and status. "Don't take it personally," Richard assured me when I mentioned his mother's attitude. She was the same way with my first wife. That should have been a warning sign, but I was too caught up in the fantasy to see clearly. After the honeymoon, Richard suggested we move into the Tudor mansion temporarily, while we looked for our own place. "It's spacious enough that we won't be on top of each other," he promised, "and Eleanor could use the company." I agreed, excited to live in such a beautiful home, even if it meant sharing space with my frosty mother-in-law. I had no idea I was walking into a carefully orchestrated test, one that I would fail spectacularly. The first few weeks after moving in, I tried to establish myself as the lady of the house. I rearranged furniture, ordered new drapes for the master bedroom, and started planning a renovation for the kitchen. Eleanor watched silently as I made changes to the home she'd occupied for decades. When I suggested replacing the antique sideboard in the dining room, she finally spoke up. "That piece has been in the family for 4 generations. she said quietly. I remember laughing, actually laughing, as I responded, well, it's time for an update. This isn't a museum. The hurt that flashed across her face was quickly masked, but I saw it. I just didn't care enough to stop. Richard, when consulted, would simply shrug and say, whatever makes you happy, darling. His indulgence emboldened me. I started referring to Eleanor as Richard's mother, rather than by her name when speaking to friends on the phone. Yes, Richard's mother is still living with us, I'd say with an exaggerated sigh. She insists on cooking and cleaning everything herself. I think she's afraid of losing her purpose. The irony of those words haunts me now. As the weeks turned into months, I became increasingly irritated by Eleanor's constant presence. She was always dusting something, preparing meals, or tending to the garden. I began to leave messes deliberately. A wine glass on the side, table, clothes draped over chairs, testing to see if she would clean up after me. She always did, silently and efficiently. At dinner parties with our friends, mostly my friends as Richard was surprisingly private about his social circle, I would introduce Eleanor as our housekeeper, if she happened to enter the room. Eleanor has been with Richard's family for years, I'd explain with a dismissive wave as she refilled water glasses or cleared plates. The first time I said it, I caught a strange look passing between Richard and Eleanor, something like a private agreement, but it disappeared so quickly I convinced myself I'd imagined it. I wish I could say this behavior was out of character for me, that I'd never been the type of person to look down on others. But the truth is, I'd become intoxicated by the status and luxury I believed I'd married into. I was playing a role I thought I deserved, and Eleanor was a convenient prop in my performance. On the morning of our first anniversary, I woke to find Richard already gone from our bed. A note on his pillow directed me to come downstairs for a surprise. Excited, I put on my silk robe and hurried down to the kitchen, expecting perhaps breakfast or an anniversary gift. Instead, I found Eleanor at the stove, preparing Belgian waffles, my favorite. "Where's Richard?" I demanded, not bothering to hide my disappointment. "He had an early meeting," she replied, sliding a perfectly golden waffle onto a plate. "He asked me to make your favorite breakfast and tell you he'll be home early with a special surprise." My anger flared irrationally. "So he left me with the maid on our anniversary?" "Typical." The words hung in the air between us. Eleanor's hands stilled on the waffle iron, and for a moment I thought I saw something dangerous flash in those blue eyes. But then she simply closed the waffle iron, untied her apron, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. It was the first time I'd seen her abandon a task, unfinished, and it left me with an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite name. That evening, when Richard returned with theater tickets and a diamond pendant, I didn't mention the morning's incident. Some protective instinct warned me to keep it to myself. I'll reveal exactly what that special anniversary surprise was meant to be later, and why it never happened. But first, let me tell you about the day I crossed a line from which there was no return. It was exactly 1 year and 7 months into our marriage when I hosted a luncheon for the charity committee I'd joined, a group of wealthy women who organized fundraisers for children's causes. These were women I desperately wanted to impress, women whose acceptance validated my place in Richard's world. Eleanor had spent the previous day preparing the house, polishing silver, arranging flowers from her garden, and baking her famous lemon tarts that Richard had mentioned were always a hit. The morning of the luncheon, I came downstairs to find her putting the final touches on a charcuterie board. "The spread looks adequate," I said, critically eyeing the arrangement. "But we need the good crystal for the mimosas, not these everyday glasses." Eleanor nodded and turned toward the cabinet where the crystal was kept. As she reached for the step stool, her elbow caught one of the glasses, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound brought my anxiety to the surface. "For God's sake," I snapped, my voice rising. "Can't you be more careful? These women will be here in 20 minutes. Eleanor knelt to pick up the shattered pieces. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Something about her calm acceptance ignited a deeper fury in me. "This is why people hire professional help instead of relying on elderly relatives," I hissed. "Richard needs to stop with this charity case arrangement and get someone competent." I didn't realize that Margot, the first committee member to arrive, had let herself in through the side door as we often did for each other. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock at my outburst. Eleanor noticed her first and straightened up, glass shards cupped in her palm. "Good morning, Margot," she said with perfect composure. "Please come in." Vanessa and I were just setting up. Margot's gaze darted between us, discomfort evident in her tight smile. "I'm a bit early," she murmured. "I can come back." But the damage was done. I spent the entire luncheon overcompensating, laughing too loudly, pouring wine too generously, all while Eleanor quietly served and cleared with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime in service. Or so I thought. The following day, my phone began pinging with cancellations. A coffee date with Stacy from the committee? Canceled. The shopping trip with Margot and Jennifer, they both suddenly had conflicts. Within a week, I noticed my social calendar, once filled with lunches and charity planning sessions, had become conspicuously empty. When I called Margot to find out what was happening, her response chilled me. "Vanessa," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I think you might want to have a conversation with Richard about Eleanor's role in your household." Before I could ask what she meant, she added, "And maybe about a few other things as well," then ended the call. That evening, I confronted Richard in his study. "Your mother is sabotaging my social standing," I accused, pacing in front of his desk. "She's turning my friends against me." Richard looked up from his papers with an expression I'd never seen before, something between disappointment and resolve. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "it's time we had a family meeting. Tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. sharp." There was a finality to his tone that stopped my protests before they began. I left his study with a growing sense of dread, like standing on thin ice and hearing the first ominous crack. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every interaction with Eleanor, every dismissive comment, every time I'd referred to her as the help or our housekeeper. Had Richard overheard? Had she been reporting my behavior to him all along? Around 3 a.m., I crept downstairs for a glass of water and noticed light spilling from beneath the door of Eleanor's private sitting room, a space I'd never entered out of a vague respect for boundaries I otherwise ignored. Curiosity and anxiety propelled me forward. I stood outside her door, listening to the murmur of her voice. She was on the phone, speaking in that slight accent that became more pronounced when she was tired or upset. "Yes, I think it's finally time," she was saying. "Richard has seen enough. No, I don't think there's any coming back from this point. The papers are all in order." My heart hammered against my ribs. Papers? Was she talking about divorce? Had she convinced my husband to leave me? I stumbled back to bed, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. In the harsh light of day, I made a desperate decision that would prove to be my final mistake in a long series of poor choices. I was going to search Eleanor's room for those papers while she was out at her weekly bridge game. I needed to know exactly what I was facing at the evening's family meeting. At precisely 2:14 p.m., I used the spare key Richard kept in his desk to unlock Eleanor's bedroom door. I'd never been inside her private space before. Richard had made it clear early on that his mother's rooms were off-limits, but desperation overrode any remaining scruples I might have had. What I found inside stunned me. The room was elegant but simple, with family photographs covering one wall. I recognized Richard at various ages, his children from his first marriage, and several people I didn't know. But it was the desk in the corner that drew me like a magnet. Unlike the antique furniture throughout the rest of the house, this was a modern executive desk with a sleek computer setup and neatly organized files. It looked like a workspace, like someone who managed significant affairs. My hands trembled as I opened the top drawer and found file folders labeled with property addresses, including the address of the Tudor mansion we lived in. Inside each folder were property deeds, tax documents, and insurance papers, all in Eleanor Thompson's name, not Richard Davis. Thompson. My mother-in-law's surname was different from my husband's. Why had I never questioned this? As I frantically rifled through the Documents. The pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. Statements from investment accounts with balances that made me dizzy. Correspondence from board members of companies I recognized. A family tree showing the Thompson name through generations of significant wealth, with Richard's name as a secondary branch. His father had been a Thompson cousin who had taken his mother's name when they married. Most damning of all was a small leather-bound book labeled Household Accounts, in D. Elegant handwriting. Inside, in Eleanor's precise script, was a detailed record of every penny spent on the household for the past 5 years, including $147,832.65 in expenses since my arrival, my clothing purchases, my salon visits, the kitchen renovation I'd insisted upon, all categorized and totaled with the meticulous attention of someone who tracked every dollar. And in the margins next to some of the larger expenses were small notes. Vanessa's anniversary gift, Vanessa's charity, luncheon, Vanessa's new car. This wasn't the accounting of household help. This was the ledger of the person who owned everything. I was still standing there, documents spread across the bed, when the bedroom door opened. Eleanor stood in the doorway. Her bridge game apparently ended early. For a long moment, we stared at each other in silence. Then, with a calm that terrified me more than anger would have, she said, "I see you've found what you were looking for, Vanessa." I scrambled for words, for excuses, but found none. "I don't understand," I finally managed, though the evidence before me was unmistakable. Richard said this was his house. Eleanor's expression held something like pity as she replied, "Richard has never claimed ownership of anything that wasn't his. You simply assumed, and he chose not to correct you. We were curious how long you would maintain the fiction without asking questions." She stepped into the room and carefully gathered the scattered documents. "The family meeting this evening will still proceed as planned. I suggest you use the hours until then to consider your position carefully." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I fled the room like a guilty child, locking myself in our bedroom as my world imploded around me. I'll tell you exactly what I found in those documents later, the numbers and dates that would be read aloud at the meeting, confirming my worst fears. But first, I need to explain the depth of my miscalculation. As I paced our bedroom, no, Eleanor's bedroom in Eleanor's house, the reality of my situation became brutally clear. I had spent nearly 2 years treating the wealthy matriarch of a prominent family like a servant. I had disparaged her to her face and behind her back. I had rearranged her home, discarded family heirlooms, and spent her money while looking down on her work-worn hands and practical clothes. The woman I'd dismissed as the help was actually the power behind everything I had, coveted. And Richard had allowed this charade to continue, watching as I revealed my true character day after humiliating day. I remembered his words from the night we met. Authenticity is rare in these circles. Had this entire marriage been a test I didn't know I was taking? I sank onto the edge of the bed, recalling the countless small moments when I could have chosen kindness over arrogance, respect over entitlement. The anniversary morning when Eleanor had prepared my favorite, breakfast, only to be called the maid for her efforts. The family sideboard I'd wanted to discard that had belonged to her grandmother. The lemon tarts she'd baked for my luncheon, even as I belittled her to my friends. What kind of person had I become? And more urgently, what kind of consequences awaited me at 7 o'clock? As the appointed hour approached, I considered running, packing a bag and disappearing before I had to face the humiliation that surely awaited me. But where would I go? My alimony from my first marriage had stopped when I remarried. I had quit my pharmaceutical sales job 6 months into my marriage when Richard suggested I focus on enjoying our lifestyle. My savings had been depleted on designer clothes and spa treatments to fit into my new social circle. I realized with rising panic, entirely dependent on the generosity of a woman I had systematically disrespected since the day we met. At 6:55 p.m., a knock came at the bedroom door. "It's time," Richard said, his voice neutral. I took a deep breath, checked my tear-swollen face in the mirror, and opened the door. My husband stood there, his expression unreadable. "Before we go down," he said quietly, I want you to know something. This was not my idea. This was not what I wanted to happen. For a moment, hope flared. Was he on my side after all? But then he continued. My mother insisted on giving you a chance. She believed people could surprise you if given the opportunity to show their true character. I argued against it, but she was determined to see for herself what kind of woman I had chosen. The hope died as quickly as it had risen. This hadn't been Richard's test. It had been Eleanor's. The family meeting wasn't just family, as it turned out. Seated in the formal living room were Richard's 2 adult children from his first marriage, Eleanor, the family attorney, and, most humiliatingly, Margot from my charity committee, who apparently was Eleanor's goddaughter. The manila folder on the coffee table seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Richard guided me to a single chair, positioned to face everyone else, then took his place beside his mother on the sofa. The attorney, a gray-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. Mrs. Davis, he began, I've been asked to clarify certain financial and property arrangements that may have been unclear to you. What followed was a methodical dismantling of every assumption I had made about my marriage. The Tudor mansion, owned by Eleanor since 1983, purchased for $1.2 million, now worth $7.4 million. The summer cottage in Maine I'd visited twice, Eleanor's since 1990. The Lexus I drove, leased in Eleanor's name. The credit cards I carried, authorized user on Eleanor's accounts. Even Richard's business, which I'd assumed was the source of our wealth, was revealed to be a modestly successful investment consultancy largely built on clients from his mother's social connections. I still remember the exact moment my world crumbled, standing in that elegant living room, wearing my designer dress that suddenly felt cheap, watching everyone's faces turn toward me with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. My husband's lawyer cleared his throat and repeated the words that made my knees buckle. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson has been the sole owner of the Riverside estate since 1983. All 5 properties, including the one you've been living in, Mrs. Davis. The manila folder he slid across the mahogany table contained property deeds with dates, figures, and signatures that made my accusations evaporate into thin air. The woman I'd been ordering around, criticizing, and calling the help in whispered phone conversations for 2 years, wasn't a stubborn old maid my husband had charitably employed. She was his mother, the multimillionaire matriarch of the family whose fortune I'd been spending. And the look in her eyes told me she had heard everything. As you can see, the attorney continued, seemingly oblivious to my distress, the Thompson Family Trust, of which Eleanor is the principal trustee, controls assets valued at approximately $23.7 million. Richard, as her son, receives a generous allowance and will inherit a portion of the estate, but control of the properties and primary accounts remains with Mrs. Thompson. Each word was another nail in the coffin of my marriage, my status, my future. I glanced at Richard, hoping for some sign of support, but his face remained impassive. Eleanor, however, was watching me with those piercing blue eyes, as if still evaluating, still testing. When the attorney finished his clinical assessment of my precarious position, silence filled the room. It was Eleanor who finally broke it. The question now, she said, her voice steady, is what happens next. She folded her hands in her lap, those hands I had dismissed as those of a maid, that had actually built and maintained the fortune I had been squandering. That depends, she continued, on whether there is anything worth salvaging here. I opened my mouth to speak, though I had no idea what I could possibly say to undo 2 years of callous behavior. Before I could form a word, the doorbell rang. Eleanor glanced at her watch. That would be Diana, she said. Richard's daughter Emma rose to answer the door, returning moments later with a woman I'd never seen before. Sorry I'm late, the newcomer said, setting a laptop bag on the side table. Traffic was terrible. Eleanor nodded in acknowledgement. Vanessa, this is Diana Chen. She's a journalist with the Lakeside Heights Register. My blood ran cold. A journalist? Was this entire humiliating revelation going to be tomorrow's headline? Eleanor must have read the panic on my face because she added, Diana is here as a courtesy. She's been working on a profile of women philanthropists in our community. My name has come up. The unspoken message was clear. Eleanor could ruin me. Publicly, if she chose to. My treatment of her could become common knowledge among the very social circles I had been so desperate to impress. I suddenly found it difficult to breathe. Margot spoke for the first time since I'd entered the room. Eleanor has been the anonymous donor behind the Children's Hospital Wing, the Women's Shelter renovation, and the scholarship program our committee takes credit for organizing, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. While you've been calling her the help to my face. She's been signing the checks that fund the charity work you use to boost your social status. Each word was a physical blow. I remembered the committee meetings where I'd boasted about our donors and our impact, never once wondering where the money actually came from. I thought of the volunteer appreciation luncheon where I'd asked Eleanor to serve coffee rather than inviting her to sit down. The journalist was watching this exchange with keen interest, her pen poised over a notepad. Was she recording this? Would my disgrace be documented for public consumption? I looked desperately toward Richard, but he was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched tight. No help would come from that quarter. It was Eleanor who again took control of the situation. Diana, she said calmly, would you mind giving us a few more minutes as a family? Margot can show you the garden while you wait. When the journalist and Margot had left, Eleanor turned her full attention to me. I think it's time we heard from you, Vanessa, she said. All eyes in the room turned expectantly in my direction. What could I possibly say? That I was sorry for treating her like a servant? That I regretted my arrogance and entitlement? The words seemed hollow even as they formed in my mind. But sitting in that room, stripped of my illusions and facing the consequences of my actions, I found myself speaking from a place of raw truth I hadn't accessed in years. I became someone I don't recognize, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. Someone who valued status over kindness, appearances over reality. I was so afraid of losing the life I thought I'd found that I never questioned what it was built on. Tears slid down my cheeks, but I made no move to wipe them away. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. What I did, how I treated you, was unforgivable. I looked directly at Eleanor, forcing myself to face her steady gaze. If I could go back and change every dismissive word, every cruel assumption, I would. But I can't. All I can say now is that I'm sorry, and I understand if that's not enough. For a long moment after I finished speaking, no one said anything. Eleanor's expression remained unreadable, her eyes searching mine as if trying to determine the authenticity of my remorse. Finally, she nodded once, decisively. Richard, she said, not taking her eyes from my face. Would you please bring the second folder? My husband rose and retrieved another manila envelope from the desk in the corner. This one was thinner than the first, containing only a few sheets of paper. Eleanor took it and held it in her lap, still watching me. I believe in second chances, she said quietly. Not because people always deserve them, but because sometimes they need them to become better versions of themselves. She opened the folder and removed what appeared to be a legal document. This is a rental agreement for the carriage house on the eastern edge of the property. It's a separate building with its own entrance and facilities. The terms are $200 per month, including utilities. I stared at her, uncomprehending. Was she offering me a place to live? Was this a separation agreement? Eleanor continued, should you choose to accept these terms, you would be my tenant, not my daughter-in-law's social accessory. You would find your own employment and pay your own way. You would rebuild your life on a foundation of truth rather than appearances. She handed me the document. Richard and I have discussed this at length. He still believes there may be something genuine between you beneath the social climbing and status seeking. I remain to be convinced. My hands trembled as I took the papers from her. This is not what I expected, I admitted. Eleanor's mouth curved slightly. No, I imagine you were anticipating either immediate eviction or a humiliating public exposure. Those options were discussed. I won't deny it. but I've lived long enough to know that people sometimes need to lose everything before they understand what truly matters. Richard spoke then, his voice rough with emotion. The choice is yours, Vanessa. We can announce an amicable separation, handle things quietly. You can stay in the carriage house until you decide what you want to do next. Or, he hesitated, glancing at his mother. Or you can try to rebuild what we started, but it would have to be on different terms. Complete honesty. No. Pretense. I looked between them. These two people I had so fundamentally misunderstood. The powerful matriarch I had dismissed as a servant. The husband whose tolerance I had mistaken for weakness. And if I choose to try again? I asked tentatively. Eleanor answered, her voice firm. Then you begin as my tenant and Richard's estranged wife. You prove through actions, not words, that you can be trusted with a second chance. You earn back what you tried to take through deception. She stood, smoothing her simple slacks with hands that had never needed manicures to command respect. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Diana's article will either include a warm family portrait or a discreet mention of Richard's separation. The choice, like many you've failed to recognize until now, is yours. With that, she left the room, the attorney following close behind. Richard's children departed without speaking to me, their contempt evident in every line of their bodies. Only Richard remained, standing awkwardly by the fireplace. Did you ever love me? I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. I loved who I thought you might be, he finally said. Someone who could see value beyond price tags. Someone who would appreciate my mother for her strength and wisdom, rather than judging her by her appearance or occupation. He shook his head. The woman I fell in love with at the gala. The one who seemed authentic and unpretentious. I kept waiting for her to return. The pain in his eyes was answer enough. I had failed his test as surely as I had failed Eleanor's. As he turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. The guest room is made up. Your things can stay in the master bedroom until you decide. Then he too was gone, leaving me alone with the rental agreement and the shattered pieces of the life I had tried to build on lies. I barely slept that night, pacing the guest room as I wrestled with my options and, more painfully, with the person I had become. I thought about my first marriage, how the red flags had been there from the beginning, but I'd ignored them in favor of the story I wanted to believe. I'd done the same thing with Richard, only in reverse, creating a narrative of wealth and status around him without bothering to verify any of it. I'd been so afraid of being alone, of being ordinary, that I'd sacrificed my integrity for the illusion of importance. As dawn broke, I found myself in the kitchen, drawn by the smell of coffee. Eleanor was there, dressed in her usual simple attire, preparing what looked like scone dough. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "There's coffee in the pot," she said, gesturing with a flour-dusted hand. I poured myself a cup and sat at the island, watching her work. "You're up early," I ventured. She continued kneading the dough, her movements practiced and efficient. "I've risen at 5:30 every day for the past 50 years, she replied. "Habits of discipline don't change with circumstances." We sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the soft slap of dough against the marble countertop. Finally, I gathered my courage. "I'd like to accept the carriage house offer," I said, "and I'd like to try to rebuild my marriage if Richard is willing. But I understand it has to be on your terms." Eleanor stopped kneading and looked up at me, her gaze assessing. "Not my terms," she corrected. "Reality's terms. Truth's terms." She shaped the dough into rounds with quick, precise movements. "The world as it actually exists, not as you wish it to be." She placed the scones on a baking sheet and slid them into the oven before continuing. "I married into the Thompson family as a cook's daughter. My husband's parents tested me too, though perhaps less elaborately. They wanted to know if I loved their son or their money." She wiped her hands on a towel, her expression distant with memory. "I worked in this kitchen as a genuinely paid employee before I became its owner. I never forgot what it felt like to be judged by my occupation rather than my character." The revelation stunned me. "You were actually household help once?" Eleanor smiled slightly. For 3 years. Thomas Thompson fell in love with me while I served his family's meals. His parents were convinced I was a gold digger. She met my eyes directly. The difference between us, Vanessa, is that I never pretended to be anything other than who I was. I didn't change my speech, my clothes, or my values to fit into their world. I made Thomas meet me as an equal, not as a prize to be won or a status symbol to be displayed. She checked the timer on the oven. When he died 20 years ago, I inherited everything because I had proven my worth, not through charm or beauty or social connections, but through integrity and hard work. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me. If you want a second chance with my son, you'll need to discover who you truly are beneath the designer clothes and calculated smiles. And it won't be easy. Trust, once broken, requires more than apologies to repair. Richard entered the kitchen then, dressed for work in a suit that I suddenly realized was well made, but not extravagant. Nothing about him suggested the wealthy heir I had imagined him to be. He nodded to me cautiously as he poured his coffee. "Have you decided?" he asked. I took a deep breath. "I'd like to try again," I said quietly. "The real way this time, starting with the carriage house." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "I'll have the keys for you this evening," he said. "And I've asked Emma to help you move your things." His daughter. The one who had looked at me with undisguised contempt the night before. It was my first test, I realized. Accepting help from someone I had hurt indirectly through my treatment of her grandmother. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate that." Eleanor watched our exchange without comment, but I thought I detected a slight softening around her eyes. As Richard left for work, I remained at the island. My future uncertain, but clearer than it had been in years. "I don't know how to be anyone but who I've been," I admitted to Eleanor. She removed the golden scones from the oven, their buttery aroma filling the kitchen. "None of us do," she replied. "We can only become who we choose to be next." The carriage house, as it turned out, was a charming 2-bedroom cottage that had originally housed the groundskeeper. Eleanor had renovated it 5 years earlier with hardwood floors, updated appliances, and large windows that filled the space with natural light. It was smaller than any home I'd lived in as an adult, but far from the punishment I might have deserved. Emma arrived at noon to help me move, her manner professional, but cool. "Grandmother asked me to assist you," she said by way of greeting. "I've brought, some boxes." We worked in silence for the first hour, carefully packing clothes and personal items. I noticed she left behind anything that had been purchased during my marriage. The designer handbags, the expensive jewelry, the custom-made clothing. When I reached for a cashmere sweater Richard had given me for Christmas, she gently intercepted my hand. "Those things stay," she said quietly. "You're starting fresh, remember?" There was no malice in her voice, just matter-of-fact certainty. I nodded and moved on to my books and photographs, things that had been truly mine before I entered the Thompson household. As we carried boxes to the carriage house, Emma gradually began to thaw. "You know," she said as we arranged my meager belongings in the bedroom, "Dad really did care for you. He said you made him laugh in a way no one had since Mom left." I paused, a framed photo of my parents in my hands. "I did love him," I said softly. "I just got lost in trying to be someone I thought he wanted." Emma gave me a long look. "That's the thing about Dad. And Grandmother, too. They never wanted you to be anyone but yourself. That was the whole point." She straightened a stack of books on the nightstand. "The real test wasn't whether you were good enough for their world. It was whether you could see beyond the trappings to what actually mattered." Her words hit me with the force of revelation. I had been so busy trying to fit into what I perceived as their wealthy lifestyle that I had completely missed their true values, the work ethic, integrity, and unpretentiousness that Eleanor had embodied all along. I had failed their test not by being from a different social class, but by revealing a character that prized appearance over substance. That evening, Richard came to the carriage house with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I thought we might talk," he said, standing awkwardly on the porch. I invited him in, acutely aware of how different this setting was from the copper mansion up the hill. We sat at my small kitchen table, the silence between us heavy with all that had happened. "I should have been honest with you from the beginning," he finally said, pouring the wine. "About my mother, about our family situation." He passed me a glass. "I thought it would be a way to know if you loved me for myself or for what you thought I could provide." I took a sip, letting the rich flavor ground me in the present moment. "I understand why you did it," I said, "but it was still a deception. We both began with lies, yours of omission, mine of commission." He nodded, acknowledging the truth of my words. "Where do we go from here?" he asked, and I heard the genuine question beneath the words. Did I want to rebuild, or was I simply choosing the option that kept me connected to the lifestyle I had coveted? I considered my answer carefully, knowing it might determine the course of whatever remained between us. "I'd like to get to know the real Richard Davis," said finally. "The man who respects his mother enough to let her maintain her independence. The man who values substance over appearance. I'd like to discover if that man and the real Vanessa, whoever she turns out to be, might have a future together." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And who is the real Vanessa?" I laughed softly, without humor. "I'm not entirely sure anymore. I've spent so long trying to be what I thought others wanted that I've lost track of myself." I looked around the simple, elegant space of the carriage house. "But I think she might be someone who appreciates this home for its warmth rather than its market value. Someone who wants to earn her place in the world rather than marry into it." I met his eyes directly. "Someone who needs to relearn what truly matters." Richard reached across the table and took my hand, the first physical contact between us since the revelation. "I'd like to meet her," he said quietly. "Perhaps we could start with dinner. Just the two of us. Somewhere simple." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was an opening. A small chance to begin again on a foundation of truth. "I'd like that," I replied. As he left that night, he paused at the door. "Mother asked me to tell you she's looking for part-time help with the Thompson Foundation. Their administrative assistant is going on maternity leave next month, if you're interested in applying." The offer hung in the air between us. Not charity, but opportunity. A chance to learn about the philanthropic work I had claimed to value while actually contributing to it, rather than using it for social advancement. "Tell her I'll submit my resume tomorrow," I said. Richard nodded, satisfied, and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Standing alone in my new home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The quiet dignity of choosing a harder truth over a comfortable lie. The following weeks were a study in humility and rediscovery. I interviewed for the foundation position and was hired on a probationary basis. My pharmaceutical sales experience apparently translated well to donor relations, though Eleanor made it clear my performance would be evaluated objectively. I sold my designer wardrobe items on consignment to pay the first few months' rent on the carriage house, keeping only a few practical pieces for work. Richard and I began dating again, cautiously at first. Coffee after foundation meetings, occasional dinners at modest restaurants where the focus was conversation rather than being seen. Slowly, tentatively, we began rebuilding what had been broken, this time with our eyes wide open. The journalist, Diana Chen, published her profile of Eleanor in the Register, mentioning only that she lives with her son Richard and enjoys gardening and cooking alongside the significant philanthropic work she had done anonymously for decades. There was no mention of me or the near implosion of the family, a kindness I recognized as Eleanor's doing. 3 months into my new life, Eleanor invited me to Sunday dinner at the main house. It was my first time back since moving to the carriage house, and I approached with trepidation. Richard met me at the door, squeezing my hand reassuringly before leading me to the kitchen. Eleanor was there, as always, preparing a roast with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. "Vanessa," she acknowledged with a nod. "Thank you for coming." I noticed she had set 3 places at the Yutsao kitchen table rather than the formal dining room we had always used during my time in the house. "Can I help with anything?" I asked. She handed me a peeler and gestured to a bowl of potatoes. "Yes, you can. We worked side by side, the simple domestic task creating a bridge between us that elegant dinner parties never had. As I peeled potatoes with hands no longer perfectly manicured, Eleanor spoke about the Foundation's upcoming projects, asking my opinion on donor approaches and event planning. She wasn't warm. I doubted Eleanor Thompson had ever been what anyone would describe as warm, but she was respectful, treating me as a colleague rather than an interloper. During dinner, I noticed something I had missed in my previous life in this house. The photographs on the walls weren't just decorative. They told the story of a family built on work and principle rather than display. Eleanor in a simple wedding dress beside a handsome young man with Richard's eyes. Eleanor receiving an award for community service in the 1980s. Richard's graduation from State University rather than an Ivy League school. The narrative I had constructed about old money and inherited privilege was undercut by the visual evidence of lives dedicated to earned success and quiet generosity. "The carriage house seems to be working out for you," Eleanor observed as we cleared the dishes together afterward. It wasn't quite a question, but I answered anyway. "It's teaching me a lot about what I actually need versus what I thought I wanted," I said honestly. She nodded as if confirming something to herself. "Richard tells me you've been volunteering at the women's shelter on weekends." Again, not a question, but I recognized it as the test it was. "Yes," I said. "It helps to remember that my worst day is still better than what many people face." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something in her posture relaxed slightly. "Good," was all she said. It wasn't forgiveness or acceptance, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. 6 months after moving into the carriage house, I received an unexpected visitor. Margot, Eleanor's goddaughter and former member of my charity committee, stood on my doorstep holding a basket of garden vegetables. "Eleanor sent these from her garden," she said, her manner reserved but not hostile. "May I come in?" I invited her inside, surprised and a little wary. We had not spoken since the night of the family meeting. She looked around the carriage house with interest, taking in the modest furniture and the conspicuous absence of luxury items. "You seem to be adjusting," she commented, accepting the glass of iced tea I offered. I nodded, waiting for her to reveal the purpose of her visit. "I wasn't sure I believed it," she continued. "When Eleanor said you were actually doing the work at the foundation, that you'd given up the social climbing and status seeking, I thought it might be another performance." She met my eyes directly. I came to see for myself. I could have been offended by her skepticism, but truthfulness had become my practice in recent months. "I understand your doubt," I said. "The woman you knew before was performing a role she thought would gain acceptance. She wasn't someone I'm proud of now." Margot studied me for a long moment. "Eleanor says you've shown promise at the foundation, that you have good instincts for matching donors with projects they'll care about." The praise, however secondhand, warmed me unexpectedly. "I'm trying to use my skills for something worthwhile," I said simply. Margot nodded, making a decision. "We're putting together a new committee for the teen mentorship program. Smaller than the main charity committee, more focused on direct service than fundraising." She set down her glass. "Eleanor suggested I invite you to join us." The offer stunned me. A chance to return to the social world I had been exiled from, but on entirely different terms. "I'd be honored," I said, meaning it in a way I never had when mouthing similar platitudes at charity galas. "But I want to be clear. I can only contribute my time and effort, not financial backing." Margot's smile was small but genuine. "That's exactly what we need more of. The first meeting is Tuesday at 7 at the community center." As she left, she added, "It's good to see the real you, Vanessa. Or at least, someone closer to the real you." As my first anniversary. In the carriage house approached, Richard suggested we take a weekend trip to celebrate my Independence Day, as he had come to call it. Our relationship had evolved into something deeper and more authentic than the whirlwind courtship that had led to our hasty marriage. We still had difficult moments, still navigated the wounds of past deceptions, but we did so with an honesty that felt revolutionary to me. The weekend he proposed was the same one we had spent in the Hamptons early in our relationship, the extravagant trip where he had spared no expense to impress me. "I thought we might go back," he said as we walked through the gardens that connected the main house and the carriage house. "But differently this time." I raised an eyebrow, questioning. "A modest bed and breakfast instead of the resort," he explained. "Picnics on the beach rather than five-star restaurants. The real Hamptons, not the showpiece version." The thoughtfulness of the suggestion touched me deeply. "I'd like that," I said, leaning into him as we walked. "The real version sounds much better than the performance." The night before our departure, Eleanor invited us for dinner again. A more frequent occurrence now that the acute awkwardness had faded into a careful cordiality. As we finished the meal, she disappeared briefly into her study, returning with a small box. "I have something for you, Vanessa," she said, placing it on the table between us. I opened it cautiously to find a delicate silver bracelet, simple but elegant, clearly vintage. "It belonged to my mother," Eleanor explained. "She was a housekeeper for a wealthy family in Boston before she married my father, who was their gardener." The parallel to my own mistaken assumptions about Eleanor was not lost on me. She wore it to remind herself that dignity comes from within, not from what others perceive. She met my eyes steadily. "I thought you might appreciate that message now." I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist, deeply moved by the unexpected gift. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'll try to be worthy of it." Eleanor's expression softened imperceptibly. "You already are becoming so," she said. It was the closest thing to explicit approval she had ever offered me, and it felt more valuable than all the luxury items I had once coveted. That evening, as I packed for our weekend trip, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past year. From the entitled woman who had called Eleanor the maid to the person I was becoming, someone who valued substance over appearance, who was learning to find dignity in honest work and authentic relationships. The carriage house that had initially seemed like a punishment had become a sanctuary, a place where I could rebuild myself on a foundation of truth rather than illusion. I placed Eleanor's bracelet carefully in my weekend bag, a tangible reminder of how far I had come and how far I still had to go. When Richard picked me up the following morning, I noticed something different in his expression as he looked around my small home. "What?" I asked, self-conscious under his scrutiny. He smiled, the warm, genuine smile that had first drawn me to him at the charity gala 3 years earlier. "You look like you belong here," he said simply. "Not in the carriage house specifically, but in your own skin. You look authentic." It was the highest compliment he could have paid me, and I recognized it as such. As we drove away from the estate, the main house stately on its hill and my carriage house nestled at the edge of the property, I felt something settle within me, the quiet certainty that I was finally on the right path. Now, 2 years after that fateful family meeting where my world fell apart, I live in a different reality entirely. Richard and I have remarried, a small, sincere ceremony in Eleanor's garden with only family and close friends present. We live in a modest home we purchased together in a neighborhood known for its community involvement rather than its prestige. I still work at the Thompson Foundation, having earned a permanent position through genuine effort rather than familial connection. Eleanor, now 81 but still sharp as ever, has dinner with us every Sunday, her relationship with me transformed from antagonism to a wary respect that occasionally verges on affection. The woman who called her mother-in-law a maid, who looked down on work-worn hands while coveting the fruits of their labor, seems like a stranger to me now, a cautionary tale I tell myself when I feel the old urges to impress or perform stirring. The silver bracelet Eleanor gave me rarely leaves my wrist, a constant reminder that true worth has nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with integrity. Last week, as Eleanor and I worked side by side in her garden, deadheading roses with the same quiet efficiency she brings to everything, she broke our comfortable silence with an unexpected question. "Do you ever miss it? The lifestyle you thought you had married into?" I considered her question carefully, respecting her enough to give an honest answer. "Sometimes I miss the ease of it," I admitted. Not having to worry about budgets or plan for the future. Having beautiful things without earning them. I snipped a faded bloom, watching the petals scatter across the rich soil. But I don't miss who I was then. I like who I'm becoming much better. Eleanor nodded, satisfied with my answer. The true test of character, she said, her voice carrying the slight accent that became more pronounced when she spoke from the heart, is not what we do when everyone is watching, but who we choose to be when we think no one is. She looked directly at me then, those piercing blue eyes still keen despite her age. You failed the first test, Vanessa, but you're passing the more important one. And so I find myself here, sharing this story with you, not as a confession, but as a caution. How easily we can become people we don't recognize in pursuit of status or security. How quickly we can forget what truly matters when dazzled by the trappings of wealth or privilege. If someone you know is changing themselves to fit into a world that values appearance over substance, please send them my story. If you find yourself judging others by their occupation rather than their character, take a moment to remember Eleanor's work-worn hands that built a fortune through diligence and integrity. The lessons I learned through humiliation and loss, you might learn through simple reflection. Ask yourself, who am I when no one is watching? What do I value when all the external validation is stripped away? The answers may surprise you. They certainly surprised me. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found meaning in it, please like and subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear it. I'm Vanessa Davis Thompson, recording from my home office in Lakeside Heights, and I'm finally exactly where I'm meant to be.